when the head of the Senate and the President of the United States and the most powerful person in the House of Representatives are all calling for regime change in a country, it's not like the head of the State Department or the head of the CIA or the head of USAID goes back to their desk with a thumb up their butt, just waiting for time. I mean, there's something going on behind the scenes there. Now, there has been reporting that USAID money has flowed to Hamas groups, that there's been really interesting reporting on the role of the protests at Netanyahu's personal residence being funded by USAID money or through State Department cutouts, which I find very interesting if true, because these are the sort of tactics that we do in classic regime change operations.
There are ties, I can tell you from my research, between a lot of the movements, the grassroots movements in Israel that are advancing the protests against Netanyahu, the left-wing kind of protests, and a lot of U.S. organizations, NGOs, etc., that are donating money directly to these people. These are facts. You can see the money flowing. You can see some of those organizations telling you where they're getting their funding from, and some of it is from the left-wing Democrats here in the United States. So,
right.
And Wexler Fund, they're a big donor to some of those movements in Israel. So the ties are there. Whether they're trying to do a regime change or not, I think you have to be a little bit willfully blind if you think that they're not. It even goes down to the level of when you actually look at the demonstrations on the streets in Israel, right next to my house in Tel Aviv, you see people waving flags and posters saying, Biden save us, or things like that. Like they're actually calling for, because that's the narrative that they're being fed. They actually think that the left wing in the U.S. is going to save them in some way. You know what I mean? It's so distorted.
Well, they might not be wrong. I mean,
they may not be wrong, but they're not at all aware of what the administration, the left wing or the Biden administration in the U.S. is up for, what they actually want.
Right.
Like, help us, meaning help us take Netanyahu down and put Gantz or some other clown in the left wing or center political arena. You know, that's what they mean. They just keep playing the political game, which is completely rigged in Israel. I mean, Netanyahu obviously has his own agenda, but the left wing is no better. I mean, they're just puppets of.
Yeah, no, they're useful proxies. The NGOs that provide, for example, humanitarian aid often play these dual roles in funneling money, which then provides political influence. It purchases you judges, it purchases you journalists, it purchases you all sorts of civil society influence over universities in the region and things like this. And, you know, this is a classic sort of 1-2 punch that the State Department, USAID, CIA apparatus on the inside of the U.S. government and the George Soros axis on the outside of government often play in regime change operations dating back to the 1980s. This was, you know, this is a classic trick where we would want to overthrow the government of Poland, or we would want to overthrow, you know, any of the dozen countries that we did in the 1980s in the run-up to the full breakup of the Soviet Union. We would have a State Department agenda. We'd flood it with $70 million. Oftentimes that would move through these sort of Soros pass-throughs, and then those Soros pass-throughs would incubate these rent-a-riot mobs that would take to the streets, that would do protests, that would take over federal buildings, that would camp out in front of politicians' homes. And then media would be on the ground to amplify that and say, well, this is the will of the people. This is democracy. And any attempt by the state to contain those astroturfed, fake, you know, democratic insurgencies, which are just astroturfed by the U.S. State Department or CIA or State Department, are then contextualized as a crackdown on, you know, legitimate free assembly. And so it allows them to paint this democracy versus autocracy brush, which then cranks open even more funding and cranks open even more mandate for operations, because now you have this authoritarian state cracking down the will of people. And what's amazing is it totally disregards who the people vote for.
Yeah.
It says that the will of the people is the 500 people surrounding this building with signs, not the 5 million people who voted for that government. But by doing that, they're able to sort of channel this idea that the will of the people is being disrespected by the government. And so Big Daddy Uncle Sam has to break open the piggy bank to take U.S. taxpayer money to give it to the protesters so that they can topple the government, just to install a new government who will, you know, be okay with Iran, losing getting the sanctions relieved so that a bunch of NATO energy companies can 10x their profits. And we just saw this in Ukraine. The Victoria Nuland, who was the head of the U.S. Embassy for the U.S. State Department, bragged in December 2013, 2 months before we overthrew the democratically elected government of Ukraine, that the State Department and USAID had pumped $5 billion into Ukrainian civil society, meaning these right sector mobs who overthrew that government, who did the surrounding of the parliament building, the whole Maidan Square riot. I mean, it was effectively January 6th, what we're told January 6th is. But it was organized by the U.S. State Department and USAID and by George Soros groups and CIA cutouts like the National Endowment for Democracy. And they overthrew that country right after they rejected an IMF trade deal and sided with a Russian Federation deal. This is a trick that we see so many times. I find it interesting that Netanyahu and Soros are at such odds with each other. And there's this historic acrimony between Netanyahu and Soros is deeply invested in this energy transition story from getting rid of Russia. Soros has been at the tip of the spear of privatizing Naftogaz in Ukraine, which is the big Ukrainian state-owned gas company. Right. And he's sort of been the intermediary for the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and its plan to privatize Ukraine's whole state economy, because Ukraine's whole economy is basically gas. It's the gas transit point for Russia, and they want to take all that gas architecture and switch it either from an Iranian supply, as we discussed, or now a lot of it is LNG, liquefied natural gas, coming from Houston or coming from British companies and then shipped in through Poland. This is a big reason that we wanted to regime change the government of Poland, which just successfully happened 4 months ago. The Polish government was hesitant about the Ukraine war. They now have a totally pro-war, pro-EU party, but that was because Poland is the new import location from what used to be coming from Russia, because Poland has these ports. You can just go through the straits there in the Baltics. You can just port them in there and then just pipe it into Slovakia and then into Ukraine. It's another reason they were mad at the president of Slovakia, the prime minister, who happened to be shot in the face.
Exactly.
The same way that Trump was.
Assassinate, sure.
And with Netanyahu, regardless of how you feel about him, it's hard to not see the similarities between the lawfare. He was indicted on these corruption charges. Donald Trump was then, 2 years later, hit with 91 felony charges. This is what they did to Imran Khan in Pakistan, who was also hostile to the efforts against Russia. The coup against Imran Khan in Pakistan happened because of a State Department cable threatening the Pakistani parliament. This was reported by The Intercept. So then they ousted the most popular president that Pakistan has ever had. Because he was so popular and they knew he'd win the next election, they hit him with like 185 charges. And he's now currently in prison. He's barred by law from running again for president. So this is one of these strategies where it comes down to destabilization. They try to internally destabilize a country that has a secure government they're trying to overthrow, because only in that destabilized state can they take the extraordinary action to install a new puppet government. And I suspect that's what they're trying to do in Israel. Israel.
So I just want to simplify and ask for dummies. So you actually are saying perhaps Netanyahu does have the best interest of Israel and he's trying to protect that, and some other forces don't think that he is the right guy to lead Israel right now, and someone else will be easier to control? Is that?
Well, definitely the second one. I mean, the fact is Netanyahu, I'm sort of agnostic on, is he legitimate? Does he have the best interest at heart? The fact is he is, I think there is legitimacy to calling him a so-called hardliner, in the sense that he does not budge, he does not play ball in the way that I think that a sort of Benny Gantz type would. I think that regardless of whether it's the correct vision for Israel, it is a axiomatic, dogmatic, unshakable vision for Israel. And because of that, you have diplomats in the United States who would prefer to have a more malleable person. And I think that especially when it comes to the oil and gas in the region, when it comes to the Iran.